Welcome to Real Estate Focus. I'm Calvin Law. We're going to talk about Airbnb. My guest is Marissa Troung. Marissa is an expert in Airbnb, and she's going to be here to share her insight, information, and her expertise with us. So welcome, and thank you for being here.
Well, I'm grateful for being asked, so thank you for having me.
For being here, and thanks for your time as well.
Of course.
Let's have some fun. So let's go into it. So first of all, Airbnb, I think, is sort of new to a lot of people still nowadays, right? Because in the old days, I mean, and until today's as well, it's like a lot of people, rather rent hotels instead of Airbnb. So Airbnb is a major factor, if you will, in the hotel industries and also hospitality industry as well. So if you will, what is Airbnb?
Yeah, so to your point, Airbnb certainly is one of those components that has disrupted the housing market in the short-term space. And by that I mean, certainly, unless you've been living under a rock, you've never heard of Airbnb, but basically the story goes that back in 2007, there were these two young guys that were living in San Francisco, and they were having trouble paying their rent. And one of them said, well, I heard there's a big convention in town. Why don't we put in MySpace at the time? That was kind of like the social media, if you will, of the day. Put out there that we can put an air mattress in our living room and charge people money for it since there's no available hotel rooms because of this major convention in San Francisco. Well, so that one idea turned into a huge business, and by huge business, I think there's like, the company itself is over $13 billion as far as it's worth. There are over 100,000 Airbnb hosts. And in like every market possible, if you are looking for a place to stay, Airbnb is certainly one of those places. And it's interesting because the company itself doesn't own any space. They don't own any hotel rooms. They're basically an online portal for people to find a place to stay. Interesting.
So basically, as we just talked about it, the housing, in terms of housing-wise, I mean, when we talk about Airbnb, there are no like housing like hotel and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. They're usually like apartments, multi-families or single-family homes, right? Or even condos, if you will.
Of course, there's a myriad of different opportunities if someone is interested in using the Airbnb portal to find accommodations. Everything from a one-bedroom apartment to a shared space with a host family to a yurta, if you will. I mean, you can pretty much find any type of accommodation. The most recent one I think that was most unusual is you have the ability to rent an Airbnb space on a boat.
Interesting.
So they recently launched this new program called Airbnb Experience, where people that have knowledge and experience in different kinds of events or different kinds of activities will walk you through that process and actually host that for you as well. Now, I don't work for Airbnb, so that we're clear. This is not an Airbnb sort of commercial. This is just me talking about what this opportunity is as far as an alternative for housing.
Interesting. So it comes with a variety of different housing forms, if you will, and what about trailers? I mean, they rent out trailers as well, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. That's certainly an option as well.
Right. Okay. So in terms of Airbnb, how does it work?
So if someone was looking for accommodations, they would simply go to the airbnb.com website and put in where they'd like to go, how long they'd like to stay, how many people. There's the ability to filter for things like bedrooms and bathrooms, if you wanted a shared space or a private space. It's pretty much a way for you to facilitate finding accommodations. On the receiving side, a host will get an opportunity to host that family or that stay using the Airbnb profile as far as getting a notification that there's somebody that's interested in utilizing their space. So it's basically kind of like a matchmaker, if you will.
That's interesting. So in terms of the responsibilities of the owners or hosts, I mean, what are the responsibilities?
That's a good question. Yeah. So as an Airbnb host, it is the requirement to fulfill the space by utilizing the opportunity, the property to be disclosed at its most honest, as far as being able to say that the place is going to be equipped with certain essentials, or there's going to be a certain number of bedrooms or bathrooms. And because it is a community of users, then the Airbnb hosts have the ability to get rated by the guests that stay there as far as their experience and how honest they were about the space itself.
Interesting. So basically, the ratings are very important.
It is, absolutely. There's the ability to add, to achieve accolades within the Airbnb host community if your ratings are a certain level, if you are not canceling, if you are not changing the terms of the conditions of the relationship during that hosting event, then the accolades that you have the ability to win or earn actually push you closer to the higher search criteria, if you will. So imagine like Google searches. Airbnb uses a very similar algorithm to that as well.
Yeah, so just like, as when we look at hotels or motels, we look at the ranking, 5 stars or 4 stars, and what is the score, if you will, 3.8 or 4% or 5%, so that's how they attract, guests,
They actually
to
take
book
it
their
even
hotels.
one step further, where the Airbnb host will not only rank from a 1 to 5 star, but they'll have the ability to also incorporate information about their experience. For example, I had one Airbnb guest once say to me, the accommodations for this space was wonderful, all the details were there, and the communication was terrific. So that it's not just the 1 to 5 star, there's also the ability to input additional information so that other potential hosts can see that kind of information on the space as well.
So do they, when they book an Airbnb, do they reach out to you and communicate with you directly as the owner?
As the owner of the space, there is the ability to communicate via the Airbnb app. But no personal information is shared until there's a double handshake, if you will. The host accepts the guest accepts the host, and then personal information is shared at that time. All other communications prior to that is done on the Airbnb portal.
Gotcha. Okay. So I know that there might be different tiers of level of services. So does Airbnb cheaper than regular hotel rates?
That's such a loaded question, just because there's such a myriad of opportunities to be a guest in an Airbnb space, everything, as I said, from a shared space to a luxury mansion. And so really, I think it's about the beauty being in the eye of the beholder, where if you are familiar with staying in a hotel and you usually stay at like 3-star hotels, then certainly you can find those types of accommodations in Airbnb as well, as far as your level of expectation. But to answer the question about whether or not it's cheaper or more expensive, it really depends on what the market is dictating in that specific area. For example, if you were to go to some place like Cabo San Lucas and look for a hotel during Christmas season, the rates are going to be extremely high. Airbnb rates are going to be probably pretty similar to that. If you're looking at maybe going to New England in the dead of winter, the Airbnb rates are probably going to be a little bit less than the hotel rates are, because there's a different expectation as far as the real estate and how much it costs.
Interesting. So it varies.
It varies.
Yeah, right. So you mentioned about the market. So is that based on the market rate in each region, cities or towns and stuff like that?
Certainly, as an Airbnb host, there is the ability to see what the going rate is per night for the accommodations that are similar to you. So yes, they do provide market statistics, so that, and you always have the ability to kind of say, yes, I'd like to host where the market is, or no, I'd like to lower my rates just so that I can increase my occupancies, or I'd like to higher my rates because I'd like to be more selective as far as who's staying in my place.
Interesting. So you mentioned about short term. So how short terms? Like 1 day, 1 week, 2 weeks?
So currently, the average time that in Airbnb, as far as people staying, is about 2 weeks. However, there is also the ability to stay for 1 night or 2 nights. As an Airbnb host, there is the ability to say, I only want a minimum of this many nights for someone to stay. Or there's the possibility of saying, I want to only have people stay a maximum of 2 nights. I don't want anybody staying there long term. So again, it's really very flexible as far as being able to host to the way you want to host.
And in terms of Airbnb, I know that it's sort of a little bit different than large hotels, So in terms of maintenance-wise, I mean, now do you do the maintenance and, cleaning afterwards, or you hire people to do it?
That's a good question. So I have been hosting Airbnb for a long time, and there are certainly successful ways to manage an Airbnb program, and having a good staff and backup is definitely one way to do it. Like a hotel guest, the expectation for an Airbnb guest is much higher than it would be for a regular tenant, if you will. So things like being able to provide essentials like towels and soap, if somebody walks into an Airbnb property and those things aren't there, then they have that expectation that those things will be delivered or managed immediately. And so if someone is considering wanting to be an Airbnb host, my first suggestion in diving into that foray is to make sure that proximity to the location is not going to be a challenge, because when a host says jump, you really have to jump pretty quickly.
Interesting. And what about in terms of locations-wise? I mean, do they have to be safe and secure?
Okay, so it's two different questions. The first, as far as location-wise, my suggestion always with somebody that wants to host an Airbnb is to potentially look at what other properties are out there in Airbnb in that specific region that Airbnb host candidate is thinking about, just to see what the market is doing as far as what the rates are, what the accommodations or occupancy rates are going to be. And so that is certainly one way to sort of begin the research to go into that market. The second question you asked me about was safe and secure. Certainly there's opportunities for bad things to happen. I mean, we live in a world that is litigious and things aren't always perfect, right? Airbnb is no different than that. Airbnb puts in place something called a coverage protection, but really they are the online portal to accommodate, to have the guest and the host meet each other. The rest of it, again, onus of responsibility is on the beholder. For example, a good way to potentially keep an Airbnb property safe is to make sure that there are outdoor cameras on the property, so that the Airbnb host has the ability to see whether or not there's a party that's being hosted or if illegal things are happening. There is not the ability to put cameras inside of a property. That's against the Airbnb policy, but being able to see like a parking lot and how many cars are there is certainly an indicator.
Interesting. So you have to disclose that, right?
Of course.
Yeah,
of
right,
course.
because of
All
privacy
that disclosure.
issues.
Yes.
Yeah, right. Now, does Airbnb allow pets?
Some of them do. Personally, I will only allow pets in the properties that we have if they are service animals, because again, wear and tear on a property is like anything else. The more people are going in and out, then the more likely it is to have to be improved. And pets is one of those factors. But there are Airbnb hosts that will accommodate and allow pets to be in their properties. It's a personal preference.
So if they have any questions during their stay, they will call you.
If they have any questions during their stay, they'll message. I always encourage people to use the Airbnb application, just because it's a log detail of the communication going back and forth. Because if Airbnb ever has to get involved in a dispute resolution, that's the first place that they go to look.
Interesting.
But yes, they'll call me too.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
I'm sure. Yeah, because you one of the property owners,
Of
if
course.
you will. So yeah. And do you need a license to operate?
So a license isn't required to operate an Airbnb property, but what is required, and this is something that the municipalities would need to check on, is that the properties themselves need to be registered with the municipal, the counties, the towns, and the state, because there is an additional short-term tax that is the responsibility of the Airbnb host to pay. So it's not a license, but it is a registration process. But the state of Massachusetts makes that very easy to do.
Interesting. So if people decide to invest into a property and turn it down the road into an Airbnb, should they just check with the city or town first before they even buy the property?
Absolutely. I mean, we're in a
sense.
real estate focused show right now. So
Yeah.
the number one thing I always suggest for anybody that's interested in pursuing real estate and using that real estate as an end user experience, whether it be a rental or whether it be an Airbnb property or whether it be someplace that somebody wants to live, is to always check with the town first to see whether or not there are any types of restrictions for that particular property. There are some municipalities, some counties, some towns that will not allow Airbnb. And so again, before putting that check to pen to paper, and check to purchase the property, to definitely make sure that the property is Airbnb, the town will allow it.
And in terms of location-wise, I know that when you deal with gases or hospitality services, does the property have to be near, transportations or parks or other amenities?
That's a good question. So not necessarily. The property depends as far as what the essentials are going to be, what the amenities have to be on what the end user is going to be looking for, what the guest is going to be looking for. And I'll give you a specific example. There's one Airbnb property that is in the middle of a very sleepy town that does quite well for us, and people kind of scratch their heads. There's no public transportation. There's not even a grocery store in the town. And the reason why is because that town happens to have the oldest boarding school in the country and a huge population of international students from elementary school to high school. So the reason why the Airbnb property does so well is because the families that are bringing their children and dropping them at this boarding school want to be in the area for at least the first month or two so that their child gets accommodated and gets comfortable with it. That's a huge opportunity no one would have ever thought, but there's no hotels in this particular town. And so this is the only option there.
Interesting. So it's not necessary that the property has to be in a downtown area or something like that. It could be in a suburban area, but based on, I guess, what type of gases, right? So yeah. And in terms of problems, I mean, what kind of problems have you ran into? Like complaints, having like huge parties or, guests don't follow the rules and stuff like that. I mean, how do you resolve those issues?
So the number one way that those issues are resolved is to be diligent and to be on top of things. So communication is vital. Being able to be within close proximity to the property is certainly another way to alleviate some of the challenges that happen as an Airbnb host. But some of the challenges that have happened is like any other business, things like turnovers with our staff, maintenance, cleaning, supplies, things like that. It's not a passive stream of income. It's a very active job that if someone is interested in doing Airbnb, they need to recognize. It's very profitable, but it's also a lot of work. And so I guess that's the thing that is the most challenging, is recognizing that that's what somebody would be getting involved in.
Yeah, nothing is easy, right?
No.
Yeah.
And of course, there's always those crazy stories of Airbnb hosts that they come from a different place, they come from a different perspective. We've had these conversations offline before. Mm-hmm. It makes for an interesting day, for sure.
I'm sure, especially when guests come from, different countries or around the world, if you will, because they have different cultures and habits and hobbies and stuff like that, right?
So this is another great example. The other thing that we don't allow is smoking inside of any of the Airbnbs that we have. But when we have Airbnb guests that are coming from outside of the country, smoking is not something that's considered a taboo. It's very common. And so that's one of those things that's really difficult to nail down, because you can't take pictures of someone's smoking. And so if you're trying to, perhaps maybe pursue a damage claim, there's no way to take pictures of smoke, which is something you smell.
Right?
Exactly.
Yeah,
exactly.
Right. It's
It's
difficult.
an inside thing. So certainly the cultural aspects of meeting different people is so fun and interesting when you're talking about accommodating guests from around the world. But there's also the cultural challenge too that has to be recognized.
No doubt. Nothing's perfect. You learn as you go. And, life is about progression.
Exactly.
And bad and good experiences as well. Well, thank you so much for sharing, Marissa. And thank you so much for being here as well. I'd love to have you back. So just want to thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoy what we just talked about. Especially, I hope that the information that Marissa just shared is going to be helpful to you when you think about Airbnb and stuff like that. So thank you for watching, and hope to see you next time.